Hi everyone, this is Vanessa from Fabric Confetti, and I'm here today to tell you a little bit about how I started using SVGs with my patterns and why I do not include a second placement line and a tack down stitch in my designs. First of all, I started my company in 2012, so I'm almost 13 years old. And when I first entered the market, the way I got in was fabric confetti. So my patterns were a little bit shabby chic, and my applique pieces were wider than the stitching. So that meant that you couldn't just do the cutaway method, you had to cut them out a little bit larger. I did not have an electric cutter then, so what I did is I made my PDFs larger, and I would trace my PDFs. I'd print them out and trace them on Fusible, such as Heat and Bond Light or Wonder Under. I'd use the mirror files. Then I would iron that on the back of my fabric and then cut them out. And then when I had my placement for my in my design, when I placed the applique, I just would, my notes in there would just say, make sure that all the edges are covered, so that the placement lines were a little bit smaller, but you covered the placement lines. Then the stitch was about 1/8 of an inch in, and you kept the raw edges, and it was shabby chic. Then in 2013, I created my first major quilt. It was called Marianne. And I want to go about the same method, except my placement lines were going to be the exact same size as my PDF files. So I was going about doing that, and then I realized I had over 500 pieces. So this was going to be a long process. I still did it that way, except what I learned to do is cut my fusible down to 8.5 by 11, and it would fit in my inkjet printer. And then I would print on that. I'd print the files, I'd print the individual PDFs on that, and that I could use to iron to the back of my fabric and cut the pieces out. So what it did is it at least eliminated the tracing. And you can still do that with my patterns. I'm just letting you know, you can still do that. There's instructions on the second page of every pattern on how to go about that. Then I just realized that, I have to make 3 or 4 samples of everything. And to cut 3 or 4 500-piece quilts out is a lot of work. So I decided when I went to Quilt Market in 2014 to investigate what was then these new electronic cutters. And I came home from that with a silhouette and a scan and cut. So I continued to use the files that I had created for my PDFs. And what I realized is that sometimes the fabric pulled out of the stitching. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. One is I was making my stitching very, very tiny because I thought it looked very dainty. And the other reason is by default, the placement line I was creating was in the center of the stitching line. So let's say I had a satin stitch and I had a thin satin stitch. The placement line was centered underneath the satin stitch, so there was 50% in and 50% out. And that did not leave a lot of wiggle room. Now Bruce and I, Bruce from Bruce Allen Designs, now we create our embroidery over our placement lines to be 80% inside and 20% outside. That is much easier with the software that we have now, because we can offset our placement lines so that that percentage is reached. And that makes a big difference. It also makes a big difference when you're using the cutaway method, because you have very little, you only have 20% on the outside to cut your fabric away. And you can do that, but you have to do it really carefully and really close to the line. In a second, I'm going to show you what the 80-20 looks like. And after that, I'm going to demonstrate how I would suggest that if you are going to use the cutaway method, that's how you should, some tips and tricks for doing it that way. Okay? Okay, so this is an example of the 80-20. You can see there's 80% of the stitching inside and there's about 20% on the outside. Okay, so that's what that is. Now, if we're going to do if I'm going to use the cutaway method, I'll move that here. I want to make sure it's in the same place. What I would suggest is that you use fusible on the back. All right, you use fusible on the back of your piece. I use Heat and Bond Light. So then I'm going to put here. I would suggest you just tack it down in the middle of your applique piece. That'll hold it in place. And then you're going to go back to your machine and you are going to stitch out the placement line again. This will mean you have to back up and stitch out the placement line one more time. Okay, here I am over at my machine and I am going to stitch out the placement stitch one more time. Okay, now we're going to take it back over to the table and we're going to cut away the extra fabric. Okay, here we are. Now, I am not great at this. Some of you are better. But what I will tell you is we have got to get really, really close. Okay? Even to the point where if you end up going into the line a little bit, that's going to be okay. Because remember, 80% of the stitching is going to be on the inside of that. So if you cut that line a little bit, it is not the end of the world. These are those Kai double curve scissors. I love these. I'll put this back up here. Okay, here's a little nodule. I want to get everything as possible, close as possible. And you can see that I've got it really close. Now I'm going to take it back over to my machine and I'm going to stitch it out. Okay, I've just stitched this out and you can see 80-20 and I cut it so close that you can't see the outside rough edge. That again, it's absolute key that you get it as close as possible, even if you break through that placement line a little bit, because remember again, you have 80% on the inside for your stitch to cover. So I am going to repeat, you can use the cutaway method with our patterns. You have to remember the 80-20 rule. I would highly recommend using fusible on the back of your fabric because that's going to hold it down and kind of hold it in place. And then again, you can cut very, very close to the line, even if you cut through it. And if you've got the fusible on there, that's going to be holding your fabric down, okay? Another thing is before you then go to the next step, which is to stitch out the embroidery on top, you can iron the whole piece down. So you can go over the whole piece and make sure it's secure. And that's about it. So I hope this has helped. I'm going to hopefully do a bunch of these little videos just to show you tips and tricks for using fabric confetti and Bruce Allen design patterns. Thank you.